In 1926, a French inventor stood in a wheat field holding nothing more than a length of copper wire. No engine, no power source, no chemicals soaking the soil. Yet according to official records filed that same year, the crops surrounding that wire grew taller, thicker, and heavier than the rest of the field. Some reports claimed yields increased by 200%. Others said even more. Photographs were taken, patents were granted. Agricultural committees visited the site. The results were serious enough to be documented, debated, and tested again. This wasn't folklore passed down by rumor. It was written into government archives, discussed in scientific circles, and quietly acknowledged as something that shouldn't have been possible. A passive piece of metal, doing nothing at all, was somehow influencing living plants. And then, just as abruptly as it appeared, the research stopped. The inventor faded from public discussion. The experiments were no longer repeated. The idea vanished from textbooks, universities, and modern agriculture altogether. Not disproven, not debunked, just abandoned. Today, nearly a century later, most farmers have never heard of it, and most scientists are never taught it, which raises an uncomfortable question. If a single copper wire once appeared to triple harvests without fuel, chemicals, or machines, what exactly were we told plants need in order to grow, and who benefited when this idea quietly disappeared? The man behind those early experiments was not a mystic, and he was not an outsider to reality. He was trained, methodical, and obsessive in the way only serious experimenters tend to be. His name appeared on patents. His work was logged with dates, measurements, and field observations. He wasn't trying to overturn agriculture. He was trying to understand why plants behaved the way they did when placed in a very specific environment. He worked largely alone, not because he rejected institutions, but because institutions had little interest in ideas that didn't fit the dominant model of the time. Chemistry was ascendant. Fertilizers were becoming industrialized. Growth, according to the new doctrine, came from inputs you could manufacture, bottle, and sell. A discovery that relied on invisible forces already present in nature didn't fit neatly into that future. For years he repeated the same trials, different soils, different crops, different weather conditions. Sometimes the effect was dramatic. Sometimes it was subtle. Sometimes it failed entirely. He recorded all of it, successes and disappointments side by side. That detail matters, because it shows something important. This was not a man chasing miracles. This was someone trying, patiently, to isolate a principle that seemed real but difficult to control. What kept him going was a pattern he couldn't ignore. When copper was placed in a precise orientation, at a specific height, interacting with the open air above the field, plants responded. Not instantly, not magically, but measurably. Stronger stalks, deeper roots, faster recovery after stress. Enough of a difference that outside observers took notice, even if they didn't fully understand what they were seeing. And that's where the story becomes more complicated. Because once others began to look, the evidence started to pile up, but so did the doubts, not because nothing was happening, but because no one could agree on why it was happening, or how to make it behave the same way every single time. Photographs from that period still exist. Black and white images showing two fields side by side, planted at the same time, in the same soil, under the same sky. One looks ordinary. The other is visibly denser, darker, heavier with grain. Handwritten notes in the margins describe measurements taken at harvest, weight per stalk, root depth, moisture retention. Nothing theatrical, just numbers, dates, and signatures. Newspapers picked up the story, cautiously at first. Articles avoided grand claims, but couldn't ignore the visual evidence. Agricultural journals mentioned the experiments in passing, often with a tone of restrained curiosity. Committees were formed. Inspectors visited. They confirmed that no fertilizers had been added, no irrigation altered, no hidden machinery buried in the soil. The copper structures were passive, unpowered, and exposed to the open air. But alongside the intrigue was unease. Some trials showed dramatic gains. Others showed modest improvement. A few showed no effect at all. Variables were difficult to control. Weather shifted. Soils differed subtly. And without a clear theoretical explanation, the results hovered in an uncomfortable space. Too consistent to dismiss outright. too inconsistent to fully endorse. What's important is what did not happen next. There was no formal refutation, no decisive paper declaring the effect impossible, no public failure that closed the case. Instead, the conversation thinned out. Mentions became footnotes. Footnotes became silence. The evidence remained, but without an institutional framework to carry it forward, it simply stopped being discussed. At this point, it's tempting to label the entire idea as flawed and move on. But doing so avoids a more interesting question. If the effect was imaginary, why did it demand so much attention in the first place? And if it was real, even partially, why was uncertainty enough to make it disappear completely? To answer that, we have to step away from the fields and into the science of something most of us never think about at all. The quiet electrical environment that exists between the ground beneath your feet and the sky above your head. Long before anyone planted crops or built laboratories, the space between the earth and the sky was already alive with energy. The ground beneath you carries a negative charge. The atmosphere above you carries a positive one. Between them exists a constant electrical gradient, subtle but continuous, present everywhere on the planet. It doesn't need to be switched on. It never shuts off. It's simply there. Most of the time, we only notice this system during storms, when lightning makes the invisible visible. But even on calm, clear days, that electrical relationship still exists. A slow, steady movement of charged particles flows through the air and into the soil. Trees, buildings, mountains, and metal objects all interact with it in different ways. Not by generating electricity, but by shaping how that ambient field moves. Copper happens to be especially good at this, not because it creates energy, but because it conducts and redistributes what already exists. When placed upright, exposed to open air, and connected to the soil, copper can subtly alter the local electrical environment. Not enough to shock anything, not enough to register on most instruments, but enough to change gradients, tensions, and flows at a very small scale. At first, this sounds abstract, even theoretical. But the moment you look inside a plant, the idea stops being strange. Because plants are not electrically inert organisms. They never were. Every plant is already an electrical system. Inside its tissues, ions move constantly. Calcium, potassium, and chloride flow across cell membranes. Electrical signals travel from root tips to leaves in response to light, water, damage, and stress. Roots don't just grow randomly through soil. They sense their environment using chemical and electrical cues combined. When a root encounters a gradient, it responds. When conditions shift, internal electrical signals change first, long before visible growth follows. This isn't speculative biology. It's well-documented plant physiology. Plants communicate internally through slow electrical waves, coordinating growth, defense, and resource use, without a brain or nervous system. Seen through that lens, the old experiments take on a different shape. The question is no longer whether plants could respond to subtle electrical changes. We already know they do. The real question becomes whether altering the external electrical environment, even slightly, could influence those internal processes over time. That's what makes the copper wire idea uncomfortable, but not irrational. It doesn't ask plants to do something unnatural. It suggests they may be responding to signals they evolved with long before fertilizers, irrigation pumps, or laboratory controls existed. And if that's true, then the mystery isn't why the plants reacted. The mystery is why we stopped asking what they were responding to. The methods themselves were almost disappointingly simple. No complex circuitry, no buried components, no hidden power sources, just copper, arranged with intention. Upright elements exposed to open air, consistent spacing, a clear connection between sky, structure, and soil. Shape and orientation mattered because they influenced how the surrounding electrical field was shaped, not because they generated anything new. These structures acted more like funnels than engines, guiding an existing force rather than producing one. That distinction is critical because it places the method firmly in the realm of passive interaction, not active intervention. What made the idea difficult to standardize was that small changes altered the outcome. A slight shift in height, poor soil contact, nearby metal objects, or even changes in atmospheric conditions could weaken the effect. This wasn't a button you pressed to guarantee growth. It was closer to tuning an instrument. When everything aligned, plants appeared to respond. When it didn't, nothing dramatic happened. That inconsistency wasn't a flaw in the concept so much as a challenge to an industrial mindset that demanded predictability, uniformity, and immediate results. That challenge became unavoidable once chemical fertilizers entered the picture. Suddenly, growth could be forced on command, scaled rapidly, and sold repeatedly. One approach required understanding subtle natural systems and offered no consumable product. The other produced measurable results with inputs that needed constant replacement. In that environment, the copper structures weren't dangerous because they failed. They were inconvenient because if they worked even partially, they asked a different question about control, economics, and who gets to decide what counts as legitimate science. Decades later, the conversation resurfaced quietly, not through forgotten inventors, but through modern research programs with very different goals. Large agricultural studies began exploring how ambient electrical fields affect plant development, often in controlled environments and at industrial scale. Universities, government labs, and multinational research groups tested crop responses under altered electrical conditions, measuring germination rates, biomass, stress tolerance, and yield. The language was cautious, the methods conservative, but the pattern was familiar. Under certain conditions, plants grew differently when their electrical environment changed. What stood out was consistency across distance and time. Different crops, different climates, different teams with no connection to the early experiments. The reported improvements weren't always dramatic, but they were statistically meaningful, enough to rule out coincidence, enough to suggest that the old observations weren't isolated anomalies, but early glimpses of a mechanism that science simply didn't have the tools to fully explain at the time. With that renewed interest came an important clarification. There is a fundamental difference between passive systems and powered ones. The historical methods relied on ambient energy already present in the environment. No current was introduced into the soil. No voltage was applied to the plants. Modern studies make this distinction explicit because crossing that line changes everything. Passive interaction is about shaping conditions. Powered intervention is about forcing outcomes. Keeping that boundary clear isn't just about safety. It's about intellectual honesty, and about understanding what kind of system you're actually studying. The simplest way to approach this is not as a solution, but as an observation. A small test, one garden bed, or even a single row of plants, set aside to behave a little differently from the rest. The materials are minimal, a length of pure copper wire or rod, no coatings, no insulation, one end placed firmly into the soil, the other extending upward into open air. No connection to power. No attachments, just exposure. Placement matters more than force. The copper should stand upright, clear of nearby metal, fences, or structures that could interfere with the surrounding field. Spacing should be modest, not crowded. This is not about saturating the area, but about creating a subtle presence. Once placed, it's left alone. No adjustments, no expectations. The plants are treated exactly the same as the rest of the garden. Same water, same soil, same care. What follows is not instant. There is no visible surge or dramatic change. The only instruction is to watch and record. Compare leaf density, root strength at harvest, recovery after heat or stress. Some people report differences. Some don't. Both outcomes matter. The value isn't in proving a belief, but in noticing patterns over time. Because the moment you stop chasing guarantees, you begin to see what the plants might be telling you on their own. When you step back far enough, this stops being a story about copper, or wires, or even crops. It becomes a story about how entire systems decide what is worth knowing. Modern agriculture feeds billions, but it is built on a narrow set of assumptions that growth must be forced, that inputs must be added, that control is more reliable than cooperation. Anything that doesn't fit that framework is labeled inefficient, unscalable, or unscientific, even if it quietly works at the margins. The uncomfortable possibility is that nothing here was ever truly forbidden in a dramatic sense. No secret bans, no hidden councils, just a gradual narrowing of attention. Research that leads to products survives. Research that leads to understanding often doesn't. A method that can't be patented, packaged, or monetized struggles to justify its existence, especially when it asks for patience instead of certainty. Over time, silence does the work that censorship never needs to, and yet the plants themselves never changed. They still grow in an electrically active world. They still respond to gradients, signals, and forces we barely measure, let alone understand. Long before industrial agriculture, plants evolved in open fields under charged skies, shaped by conditions far more complex than nutrient formulas alone. The idea that growth might be influenced by more than chemistry isn't radical, it's ancient. What's radical is how thoroughly we learn to ignore it. So the question isn't whether a copper wire can AAA harvest. That's the wrong level of inquiry. The real question is this: if nature offers mechanisms that are subtle, difficult to standardize, and impossible to own, do we have the patience to study them anyway? Or do we only accept truths that fit neatly into systems of control? Because if something this simple was set aside once, it's worth asking how many other quiet possibilities are still standing in the field, waiting to be noticed.